When hope seemed lost, the emergency session bells echoed through the Confederation Assembly Hall like a funeral dirge. Admiral Sarah Chun stood at the massive viewing window, watching the last refugee ships limping toward the station. Each vessel told a story of lost, scorched hulls, missing sections, and the hollow eyes of survivors who had watched their worlds die. The assembly hall itself was a marvel of galactic engineering, a crystalline structure that floated in the void between three star systems. Representatives from 47 species gathered here in times of crisis, their diverse forms creating a tapestry of the galaxy's greatest minds. Today, however, that tapestry was stained with desperation. High Commander Zephyr materialized at the podium, his crystalline form catching the light from dying stars. The Xerian were ancient, their civilization spanning millennia, and their technology was considered the pinnacle of galactic achievement. When Zephyr spoke, his voice resonated through quantum frequencies that every species could understand. Fellow beings of the Confederation, he began, his tone carrying the weight of countless defeats. We have lost the Andromeda sector. The Void Hunters have consumed another 12 star systems in the past cycle. Our casualties now exceed 800 billion souls. A collective shudder ran through the assembly. The Void Hunters were unlike any enemy the galaxy had ever faced. They weren't biological, mechanical, or even truly energy-based. They were something else entirely. Entities that existed in the spaces between reality, consuming not just matter and energy, but the very fabric of existence itself. The Kalari representative, a being of pure thought housed in a biomechanical shell, projected its concerns directly into the Assembly's consciousness. Our quantum disruptors have proven ineffective. The Nexus cannons merely feed their hunger. How does one fight an enemy that grows stronger with each attack? Admiral Chun turned from the window, her weathered face showing the strain of months of impossible decisions. At 55, she was considered young by galactic standards, but her gray hair and lined features spoke of battles fought in the darkness between stars. Humanity had only joined the Confederation 30 years ago, making them the newest and often overlooked members of the Council. We've tried everything, she said, her voice cutting through the despair. Gravitational warfare, dimensional folding, even temporal displacement. Nothing works. The Void Hunters adapt to every strategy within hours. The Thrakkery war leader, a massive insectoid creature with blade-like appendages, clicked in agitation. Your species' contributions have been adequate, Admiral Chun, but perhaps it is time to consider evacuation protocols. Some civilizations are worth preserving, even if worlds must be sacrificed. The words hung in the air like a poison cloud. Evacuation meant abandoning billions to their fate. It meant watching entire species become extinct while the important civilizations fled to distant galaxies. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. High Commander Zephyr's crystalline form flickered with internal light. The Thrakkery speak of harsh realities. Our projections show complete galactic consumption within 50 standard cycles. Perhaps retreat is wisdom. No, the word came out harder than Sarah intended. Every alien eye in the assembly turned toward her. There's another option, one we haven't tried. The Voss Chancellor, a being of living metal, spoke with the sound of grinding gears. Human, your species has contributed admirably to our defense efforts. But if the combined might of the Confederation cannot stop these entities, what could your relatively young civilization possibly offer? Sarah looked around the assembly, seeing the mixture of pity and irritation on alien faces. They saw humanity as eager students, recent additions to a galactic community that had existed for millennia. They appreciated human enthusiasm, but didn't expect human solutions. You're right, she said, surprising them. We can't match your technology. Our weapons are primitive compared to yours. Our ships are slower, our shields weaker, our computational power laughable by your standards. The Thrakkery war leader's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Then what do you propose, Admiral? Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out a simple metal device no bigger than her palm. It looked ancient by galactic standards, all hard edges and mechanical interfaces. This is a communication device my grandfather carried in Earth's Second World War. It still works, even after all these years. You know why? The assembly waited in silence. Because sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Because sometimes experience matters more than technology. Because sometimes you need people who've learned to fight when everything else has failed. High Commander Zephyr's form pulsed with confusion. You speak in riddles, Admiral. The Void Hunters consume everything. How can primitive technology succeed where our greatest achievements have failed? Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Because you've been fighting them like civilized beings. You've been using rules, strategies, and technologies designed for wars between rational enemies. But the Void Hunters aren't rational. They're not even truly alive. They're a force of nature, like a hurricane or a plague. She walked to the center of the assembly, holding the old radio. On Earth, we have a saying, when the chips are down, you don't call the police. You call the old soldiers, the ones who've seen the worst, survived the impossible, and learned to make victory from defeat. The Xerian ambassador, a being of pure energy contained in a geometric shell, spoke with a voice like singing crystals. Your species' veterans are already serving in our fleets, Admiral. They fight bravely, but they are still bound by the same limitations as the rest of us. Not all of them, Sarah replied. We have a protocol, something we hoped we'd never need to use. We call it the Last Stand Protocol. The assembly murmured with interest and concern. The Kalari representative projected a question directly into their minds. What is this protocol? Sarah's expression grew distant, as if she were looking back through decades of carefully buried memories. After the Third Global War, Earth created a list, a record of soldiers who had done things that history books would never record. Men and women who had won battles that couldn't be won, survived situations that had no survivors, and made the impossible possible. We retired them quietly, gave them peaceful lives, and tried to forget what they were capable of. The Thrakari war leader's compound eyes focused intently on the human. You speak of your species' most dangerous warriors. No, Sarah shook her head. I speak of our most dangerous humans. There's a difference. These aren't just soldiers. They're survivors. They've fought in wars where technology failed, where strategies crumbled, where victory seemed impossible. They learned to win by being unpredictable, by adapting faster than their enemies, by refusing to surrender even when surrender was the only logical choice. High Commander Zephyr's crystalline form dimmed slightly. Admiral Chen, with respect, these individuals must be advanced in age. How can elderly warriors face an enemy that has destroyed our finest young soldiers? Sarah's smile returned, grim and knowing. Because age isn't a weakness when it comes with experience. Because these aren't just old soldiers, they're old soldiers who survived long enough to become old. And because sometimes the galaxy needs to remember that humans didn't reach the stars by being reasonable. The Vice-Chancellor's metal form creaked as it leaned forward. You propose to recruit retired soldiers? This seems desperate. It is desperate, Sarah admitted, but desperation breeds innovation. And innovation is what we need right now. The assembly fell silent, considering her words. Finally, High Commander Zephyr spoke. What would this protocol require? Sarah activated the old radio with a series of mechanical clicks. Full authority to recruit from Earth's veteran population. Access to military records dating back 2 centuries. And, most importantly, the promise that when these soldiers answer the call, they'll be given complete tactical freedom. The Thrakari war leader's mandibles clicked rapidly. Complete freedom? Without oversight? Without strategic coordination? Without interference, Sarah clarified. These soldiers learned to fight wars where command structure was a luxury, where intel was unreliable, and where victory depended on individual initiative. They won't fit into your standard military doctrine because they were forged in conflicts where standard doctrine meant death. The Xerian ambassador pulsed with uncertainty. This is highly irregular. Our military protocols exist for reasons developed over millennia of warfare. And yet, Sarah pointed out, those protocols are failing. The Void Hunters are winning because they don't follow your rules. Maybe it's time we stop following them too. The debate continued for hours, but eventually desperation won. The Confederation had tried everything else. Their greatest weapons had failed, their finest strategies had crumbled, and their most advanced civilizations were being consumed one by one. The Last Stand Protocol was approved by a narrow margin, with many representatives expressing grave doubts. As the assembly dispersed, High Commander Zephyr approached Admiral Chen. "I hope you understand what you're asking for, Admiral. If this fails, if your veterans prove ineffective, the consequences will be severe." Sarah nodded, already composing the messages she would send to Earth. "I understand, but I'd rather face consequences than extinction." 3 days later, the first response came through the quantum relay. It was from a small farm on Earth's North American continent, sent by a man named Marcus Rodriguez. His reply was brief and to the point. "Received your message. The boys are getting restless anyway. Give us coordinates and transport. We'll handle the rest." Sarah smiled as she read the message. The Last Stand Protocol was active. The old soldiers were coming out of retirement, and the galaxy was about to learn what humans were truly capable of when everything else had failed. The Void Hunters had consumed civilizations, devoured star systems, and broken the spirit of the galaxy's greatest warriors. But they had never faced Earth's forgotten veterans, the ones who had learned to fight in the shadows when the unwinnable and make hope from despair. The real war was about to begin. When legends awakened the transport ship Defiant, Hope emerged from hyperspace with the grace of a falling brick. Unlike the sleek vessels of the Confederation fleet, this human cargo hauler was built for function over form, thick armor plating, redundant systems, and the kind of reliability that came from decades of patches and repairs. Admiral Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the command vessel Starfire, watching the transport dock with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She had received brief files on the volunteers, but the records were heavily classified. What she did know was that these men and women represented something the galaxy had never seen before. High Commander Zephyr materialized beside her, his crystalline form reflecting the stars beyond the viewport. "Admiral, our tactical analysis suggests these individuals are significantly aged. The oldest appears to be 93 standard years. How can beings of such advanced age possibly contribute to frontline combat?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the messages she'd received from Earth. Not official military communications, but personal notes. A grandmother who still did her own farming at 85. A great-grandfather who had built his house with his own hands at 90. These weren't just old soldiers, they were old soldiers who had never stopped being dangerous. "You'll see," she said finally. The first figure to emerge from the transport was a man who looked like he'd been carved from weathered stone. Captain Marcus Rodriguez was 78 years old, but he moved with the fluid grace of someone half his age. His hair was white as snow, his face mapped with lines that spoke of decades under foreign suns, but his eyes held the sharp focus of a predator. Behind him came the others. Sergeant Maria Santos, 65, whose small frame concealed muscles like steel cable. Lieutenant Commander David Park, 85, who walked with a slight limp, but whose gaze swept the docking bay with tactical precision. Colonel James Thompson, 73, whose massive frame and scarred hands spoke of battles fought with more than just weapons. The Thackeray war leader, observing from the command deck, clicked his mandibles in what might have been concern. These beings appear to be in the final stages of their life cycles. How can they possibly face an enemy that has destroyed our finest warriors? The answer came within minutes of their arrival. The veterans had requested a briefing on the tactical situation, but instead of using the advanced holographic displays and quantum computers of the command center, they had spread out paper maps on a simple table. Actual paper, a material most galactic civilizations had abandoned millennia ago. Captain Rodriguez traced enemy positions with a pencil, another obsolete tool that somehow seemed perfectly natural in his weathered hands. Tell me about their movement patterns, he said to the assembled alien commanders. The Xerian tactical coordinator, a being of pure energy, projected detailed holographic displays. The Void Hunters advance in wave formations, consuming matter and energy to fuel their progression. They adapt to our weapons within 3.7 standard time units, rendering our technology ineffective. Rodriguez studied the patterns for a long moment, then looked up at his fellow veterans. Reminds me of the Tet Offensive. Remember that, Jim? Enemy comes in waves, adapts fast, uses our own strength against us. Colonel Thompson nodded, his massive frame leaning over the paper maps. Same principle as the Winter War. Superior technology, established positions, perfect intelligence, and still lost to people who understood the terrain better. The alien commanders exchanged confused glances. These references meant nothing to them, but there was something in the way the humans discussed strategy that was different from anything they'd experienced. There was no reverence for technology, no reliance on computational models, just the cold analysis of beings who had learned warfare the hard way. Sergeant Santos pointed to a section of space where 3 star systems had been consumed. They're following energy signatures, right? Moving toward the biggest power sources? Correct, replied the Kalari representative, its thoughts touching the minds of everyone present. They appear to be drawn to high-energy civilizations. Then we give them what they want, Santos said, simply. The Thackeray war leader's compound eyes focused intently on the small human woman. You propose to surrender high-energy worlds to them? No, Rodriguez answered, his voice carrying the weight of decades of impossible decisions. We propose to make them think they're getting what they want. Classic misdirection. You've been fighting them like they're an army, but they're not. They're more like a natural disaster. You don't fight a hurricane head-on, you redirect it. High Commander Zephyr's crystalline form pulsed with confusion. How does one redirect entities that exist partially outside normal space-time? Lieutenant Commander Park, who had been silent until now, looked up from the maps. His voice carried the careful precision of someone who had learned to make every word count. You don't fight the enemy where they're strong. You fight them where they're weak. Every predator has blind spots, even cosmic ones. The next phase of the operation began within hours. The veterans had divided into small teams, each taking command of a section of the front lines. The regular military commanders were horrified by what they saw. These elderly humans ignored established protocols, dismissed advanced tactical systems, and seemed to make decisions based on instinct rather than analysis. Colonel Thompson's team faced the first test. The Void Hunters had launched a massive assault on the Kepler station, a critical supply depot protected by the Confederation's most advanced defensive systems. The station's shields were failing, its weapons proving ineffective, and evacuation protocols were already being initiated. Thompson studied the tactical display for exactly 30 seconds before turning to his team. Maria, I need you to take those young Xerian fighters and show them how to run interference. David, coordinate with the Thackeray ground forces. They're going to hate what we're about to do, but they'll understand it later. Marcus, you're with me. We're going to do something stupid. The plan was indeed stupid by galactic standards. Instead of reinforcing the station's defenses, Thompson ordered a full evacuation while simultaneously rigging the entire facility with every explosive device they could find. Not advanced quantum charges or gravitational implosion devices, simple chemical explosives that any human engineer could have built in his garage. The Void Hunters, drawn by the energy signatures of the station's power core, swept in for what they expected to be another easy feeding. They flowed around the structure like a dark tide, their reality-warping presence beginning to consume the station's matter and energy. That's when Thompson detonated the charges. The explosion wasn't particularly impressive by galactic standards. It didn't tear holes in space-time or create artificial black holes. It was just a very large, very loud, very simple explosion that sent debris flying in all directions. The Void Hunters recoiled as if they'd been slapped. For the first time in recorded history, they showed something that might have been confusion. They had been expecting to consume refined energy, processed matter, organized systems. Instead, they had been fed chaos, random fragments of metal and polymer, uncontrolled chemical reactions, and the kind of disorganized destruction that served no strategic purpose. They don't understand waste, Thompson explained later to the bewildered alien commanders. These things are used to consuming organized energy, sophisticated technology, civilized warfare. They've never encountered beings who are willing to blow things up just to make noise. The success at Kepler Station was just the beginning. Across the front lines, the human veterans were implementing strategies that defied every rule of modern warfare. They used obsolete weapons that the Void Hunters couldn't adapt to because they didn't operate on principles the entities understood. They employed tactics that seemed random, but were actually based on decades of experience fighting unconventional enemies. Sergeant Santos led a team of Kalari soldiers in what could only be described as guerrilla warfare in space. Instead of engaging the Void Hunters directly, they set up ambushes using nothing more sophisticated than kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives. The entities accustomed to energy-based attacks found themselves vulnerable to simple chunks of metal moving at high velocity. It's like fighting ghosts with baseball bats, Santos explained to her bewildered alien teammates. They're not used to dealing with crude physical force. They've adapted to sophisticated energy weapons, but they don't know how to handle a rock thrown hard enough. Lieutenant Commander Park took a different approach. He studied the Void Hunters' movement patterns and realized they were following quantum signatures, the energy traces left by advanced civilizations. So he began laying false trails, using obsolete human technology to create energy signatures that looked like valuable targets, but were actually empty space. The Void Hunters would arrive expecting to find a thriving star system, and instead encounter nothing but the energy emissions from old human radio equipment. Park had essentially taught cosmic entities to chase false signals, like a fisherman using lures to confuse predatory fish. Their pattern followers, Park explained to the assembled alien strategists, they've learned to track sophisticated energy signatures because that's always led them to prey. But they've never encountered beings who understand how to fake those signatures with primitive technology. The real breakthrough came when Captain Rodriguez made a disturbing discovery. The Void Hunters weren't just consuming matter and energy, they were learning from it. Each civilization they devoured added to their understanding of galactic warfare. They had become so effective because they had absorbed the tactical knowledge of hundreds of species. They're fighting us with our own strategies, Rodriguez realized. Every battle plan, every tactical innovation, every strategic doctrine they've encountered, they've made it part of themselves. That's why they adapt so quickly. They're not just learning our current tactics, they already know them. The implications were staggering. The Void Hunters weren't just predators, they were the accumulated military knowledge of every civilization they had consumed. They had become a living library of galactic warfare, able to counter any strategy because they had already absorbed it from previous victims. So, how do we fight an enemy that knows everything we know? High Commander Zephyr asked. Rodriguez smiled, and for the first time since the crisis began, it was a genuinely pleased expression. We don't fight them with what they know. We fight them with what they don't know. We fight them with the kind of warfare that no civilized species would ever record in their military archives. The next phase of the operation was something the galaxy had never seen before. The human veterans began teaching alien soldiers tactics that had no names, strategies that existed only in the memories of beings who had survived the unsurvivable. They shared knowledge of warfare that was too brutal, too chaotic, too fundamentally uncivilized to ever be included in official military doctrine. They taught the Zirian how to fight without energy weapons, showing them how to use their crystalline forms as kinetic weapons. They showed the Thrakkari how to abandon their rigid formations and fight like the insects they resembled, swarming, unpredictable, and utterly without mercy. They taught the Kalari how to wage psychological warfare against enemies that might not even have psychology as other species understood it. The turning point came at the Battle of the Void Gate, where the Void Hunters had concentrated their forces for a final push toward the galactic core. The Confederation fleet, now under the tactical command of the human veterans, met them with strategies that defied every rule of civilized warfare. The battle lasted 18 hours and ended with something unprecedented in galactic history. The Void Hunters retreated. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a strategic repositioning, but an actual retreat driven by something the entities had never experienced before: uncertainty. For the first time in their existence, the Void Hunters had encountered enemies who fought without rules, who used tactics that couldn't be predicted or countered, who seemed to thrive on chaos rather than order. They had learned to consume the military knowledge of civilizations, but they had never encountered beings who fought with the accumulated wisdom of survivors. As the enemy forces withdrew into the void between galaxies, Captain Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the Starfire, watching the stars return to their normal configurations. The space around them was littered with debris, not the elegant wreckage of energy weapons, but the chaotic destruction of old-fashioned explosives and kinetic weapons. "They'll be back," he said quietly to Admiral Chun. "But not for a while. They need time to understand what just happened to them." Sarah nodded, looking out at the stars that had been saved by the actions of a handful of elderly humans who had refused to let age slow them down. "How long do you think we have?" Rodriguez considered the question with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to make accurate predictions about dangerous enemies. "Long enough to prepare. Long enough to teach the galaxy some new tricks. Long enough to make sure that when they do come back, they'll find something even more unpleasant waiting for them." The old soldier smiled, and in that expression was the promise of humanity, the refusal to surrender, the determination to survive, and the absolute certainty that as long as humans drew breath, the galaxy would never fall to any enemy, no matter how powerful or alien they might be. When respect was earned 6 months after the Battle of the Void Gate, the Confederation Assembly Hall looked different. The crystalline structure still floated in the void between star systems, but the energy within it had changed. Where once there had been desperation and fear, now there was something humanity had brought to the galaxy, hope tempered by hard-won wisdom. Admiral Sarah Chin stood before the same viewing window where she had watched refugee ships limping home in defeat. Now she observed construction vessels rebuilding the infrastructure of liberated worlds, medical ships carrying aid to recovering populations, and most importantly, mixed fleets of human and alien vessels patrolling the outer rim with a confidence that had been absent for years. The veterans had returned to their retirement, but their influence remained. Every major fleet now included human tactical advisors, and every military academy in the galaxy had begun studying something called asymmetric warfare doctrine, though few alien instructors truly understood what they were teaching. High Commander Zephyr approached, his crystalline form now bearing subtle modifications that spoke of lessons learned. "Admiral Chun, the Council is ready to convene. Today's session will be significant." Sarah nodded, adjusting the simple uniform that had become her trademark. Unlike the elaborate ceremonial garments favored by other species, she wore the practical gray and blue of Earth's military, a choice that had once seemed quaint, but now carried the weight of victory. The assembly hall was packed beyond capacity. Representatives from species that had been written off as extinct 6 months ago now occupied seats that had stood empty for cycles. The Altarian delegation had survived the consumption of their homeworld by following human-taught evacuation protocols that prioritized people over infrastructure. The Corvani had learned to fight from the shadows, using guerrilla tactics that had kept their civilization alive when all conventional resistance had failed. As Sarah entered the chamber, she noticed something that would have been unthinkable before the war. Alien representatives stood as she passed, not from protocol or courtesy, but from genuine respect. The human delegation was no longer the junior member of the Confederation. They were the species that had saved the galaxy. The formal session began with the traditional recitation of victories and losses, but today it carried different weight. The casualties were still staggering, billions of lives lost, entire civilizations damaged beyond easy repair. But they were losses in a war that had been won, sacrifices that had meaning because they had led to survival. The Thackeray war leader, his massive insectoid form bearing new scars from battles fought alongside human advisors, spoke first. The integration protocol has shown remarkable success. Our warriors have learned to adapt their tactics, to think beyond established doctrine. The enemy retreated not just from our weapons, but from our unpredictability. The Xerian ambassador, her energy form now flickering with patterns that seemed almost human in their irregularity, added her thoughts. The humans have taught us that strength comes not from the perfection of our technology, but from the flexibility of our thinking. We have learned to fight with our minds as well as our weapons. But it was the Kalari representative who spoke the words that would reshape galactic politics forever. The being of pure thought projected its consciousness directly into the minds of every delegate present, and its message was simple. We request that humanity be granted permanent membership in the Strategic Defense Council. The implications were staggering. The Strategic Defense Council was the inner circle of galactic power, composed of the 5 species that had founded the Confederation millennia ago. Membership had never been expanded. Until now. High Commander Zephyr's crystalline form pulsed with complex emotions. The proposal is unprecedented. However, given recent events, it deserves serious consideration. The debate that followed was unlike any in the Assembly's history. Instead of the usual political maneuvering and species-centric arguments, the discussion focused on practical realities. The veterans had not just won a war. They had fundamentally changed how the galaxy understood warfare, survival, and the nature of strength itself. The Voss, Chancellor, his living metal form now bearing decorations that honored fallen human allies, spoke with the grinding precision of his species. The humans have demonstrated capabilities that extend beyond military prowess. Their ability to adapt, to find solutions in impossible circumstances, to maintain hope when all logical analysis suggests defeat. These are qualities that strengthen the entire Confederation. Admiral Chen listened to the debate with mixed emotions. Part of her was proud of what humanity had accomplished, but another part remembered the cost. The veterans who had saved the galaxy were now truly retired, their bodies finally showing the accumulated strain of decades of service. Captain Rodriguez was in a medical facility on Earth, his injuries from the final battle finally catching up with him. Colonel Thompson had passed away peacefully in his sleep, worn out by a lifetime of carrying burdens that no one else could bear. When called upon to speak, Sarah stood slowly, feeling the weight of representation more heavily than she ever had before. Honored delegates, I accept this nomination on behalf of humanity, but I want to make something clear. We didn't save the galaxy because we're better than you. We saved it because we're different from you. The chamber fell silent, waiting for her to continue. Every species here has strengths that humanity lacks. The Xerian understand energy manipulation in ways we can barely comprehend. The Thrakari are natural warriors with tactical instincts we can only envy. The Kalari process information at speeds that make our computers look like stone tools. The Voss create technology that seems like magic to us. She paused, looking around the chamber at faces that had become familiar over months of desperate planning and hard-won victories. But we have something else. We have the memory of being weak. Every human who reaches adulthood carries the knowledge that we came from a small world, that we were once alone in the universe, that we had to fight for every advancement we've made. That memory keeps us humble, keeps us creative, and keeps us willing to do whatever it takes to survive. The Altarian delegate, a being of shifting light whose species had been saved by human evacuation protocols, spoke in harmonics that translated to reverence. You speak of weakness as strength. How can this be? Sarah smiled, thinking of the veterans who had taught the galaxy that age was not weakness, that obsolete could be effective, that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. Because when you've been weak, you learn to be strong in ways that strength itself can't teach you. You learn to find advantages where others see only disadvantages. You learn to win not by overpowering your enemy, but by being smarter, more adaptable, more determined. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in galactic history, the Strategic Defense Council would expand to include a 6th species. Humanity had earned its place not through conquest or dominance, But through the simple act of refusing to surrender when surrender was the only logical choice, the ceremonial aspects of the session continued for hours, but the real work began in the smaller meetings that followed. The galaxy now faced the challenge of reconstruction, of rebuilding not just physical infrastructure, but the confidence and cooperation that had been shattered by the Void Hunter War. Sarah found herself in a small conference room with the other members of the Strategic Defense Council discussing the practical implications of the new arrangement. The conversation was businesslike, focused on resource allocation and strategic planning, but underneath it was something that had been absent from galactic politics for generations: genuine mutual respect. The Outer Rim territories will require significant reconstruction, High Commander Zephyr noted, his crystalline form projecting detailed holographic maps. The Void Hunters consumed not just physical matter, but the quantum foundations of several star systems. Rebuilding will require unprecedented cooperation. The Thackeray war leader clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. Our engineering capabilities are substantial, but we lack the human talent for improvisation. Perhaps joint teams. Sarah nodded. We'll provide advisors, but the real work needs to be done by local populations. One thing we learned from the war is that solutions imposed from outside rarely work, as well as solutions that grow from within. The months that followed saw changes that rippled through every level of galactic society. Human advisors didn't just teach military tactics, they shared approaches to problem-solving that had been forged in the crucible of Earth's turbulent history. The concept of making do with what you have became a philosophy that transformed how entire civilizations approach challenges. The Xerian, masters of energy manipulation, learned to appreciate the elegance of simple mechanical solutions. Their latest starship designs incorporated what they called human redundancy, backup systems that didn't rely on sophisticated technology, but on basic physical principles that couldn't be disrupted or adapted to by future enemies. The Thackeray military academies now taught courses on unconventional tactical thinking, though their instructors still struggled to explain why deliberately appearing weak could be a form of strength. Their cadets learned to study not just the great victories of galactic history, but the desperate last stands and impossible escapes that had previously been considered footnotes. The Kalari beings of pure thought found themselves fascinated by the human concept of intuition decision-making that couldn't be reduced to pure logic, but somehow produced effective results. They began incorporating what they called non-computational analysis into their planning processes with remarkable success. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed survival itself. Before the war, survival had been seen as a temporary state, something to endure until proper solutions could be implemented. The humans had taught them that survival could be a way of life, that the skills needed to endure could become the foundation for thriving. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the military strategist who had helped coordinate the veteran recruitment, now found herself in charge of the Galactic Emergency Response Protocol. The position hadn't existed before the war, but the Confederation had realized they needed someone who understood how to prepare for the impossible. The problem with planning for emergencies, she explained to a gathering of planetary governors, is that real emergencies don't follow plans. You need to prepare people to think on their feet, to adapt to situations they've never encountered, to find solutions using whatever resources they have available. Her recommendations were being implemented across the galaxy. Every major population center now maintained stockpiles, not just of advanced technology, but of simple, reliable tools that would work even if sophisticated systems failed. Every military unit included training in primitive combat techniques that would remain effective even if energy weapons became unavailable. The veterans themselves had become legends, though they would have been deeply uncomfortable with the hero worship if they had been aware of it. Stories of their exploits spread through the galaxy, growing in the telling until fact and fiction became indistinguishable. There was the tale of Sergeant Santos holding off an entire Void Hunter assault using nothing but kinetic weapons and what humans called creative profanity. The story of Colonel Thompson somehow convincing an enemy force to retreat by making them believe they were surrounded, when in fact he had only 3 soldiers and a broken communications array. The legend of Lieutenant Commander Park navigating a damaged ship through a gravity storm using paper charts and a mechanical compass. But Captain Rodriguez had become something more than a legend. As he recovered in the medical facility on Earth, beings from across the galaxy made pilgrimages to meet the man who had taught them that age was not weakness, that experience was more valuable than energy, that sometimes the old ways were indeed the best ways. Sarah visited him whenever her duties allowed, finding him in the hospital garden, sitting in a simple wooden chair and feeding birds with breadcrumbs, a sight that would have seemed absurd to the galactic community 6 months earlier, but now struck them as profoundly wise. "How are you feeling about all this?" she asked during one visit, gesturing toward the news feeds that carried stories of human influence spreading throughout the galaxy. Rodriguez considered the question with the deliberate care she had learned to associate with him. His hair was whiter now, his face more lined, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had outmaneuvered cosmic entities. "I'm proud of what we accomplished," he said, finally, "but I'm more proud of what we taught them. It's not about humans being special, Sarah. It's about every species learning to use all of their capabilities, not just the ones that look impressive on paper." He scattered more breadcrumbs, watching small Earth birds that had been introduced to the hospital ecosystem. You know what the real victory was? It wasn't beating the Void Hunters. It was showing the galaxy that strength comes in more forms than they thought possible. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a delegation of young Thackeray military cadets who had traveled from the other side of the galaxy for the opportunity to meet the legendary human tactician. Rodriguez greeted them with the same patient courtesy he showed to everyone, answering their questions about strategy and survival with the simple clarity that had made him so effective as a teacher. Watching him interact with the alien students, Sarah realized something that would have seemed impossible before the war. The galaxy had not just accepted humanity as equals, they had embraced human values. The concepts of resourcefulness, adaptability, and refusal to surrender had become part of galactic culture. As the months turned to years, the changes became permanent features of Confederation society. The Strategic Defense Council now operated on principles that would have been alien to its founders: flexibility over protocol, adaptation over rigid planning, cooperation over hierarchy. The Void Hunters never returned. Whether they had been destroyed, driven away permanently, or were simply waiting for a better opportunity remained unknown. But the galaxy was no longer the same civilization they had once terrorized. It had learned to be unpredictable, to fight with more than just advanced technology, to survive through determination as much as through superior firepower. Admiral Chun, now bearing the title of Strategic Coordinator for Human Integration, stood once again at the viewing window of the assembly hall. But instead of watching refugee ships limping home in defeat, she observed something that filled her with quiet satisfaction. Mixed crews working together on projects that no single species could have accomplished alone, that a Xerian energy specialist worked alongside a human engineer to design power systems that combine sophisticated technology with robust simplicity. A Thackeray tactical officer trained with human veterans to develop strategies that were both disciplined and unpredictable. A Kalari analyst collaborated with human psychologists to understand decision-making processes that combined logic with intuition. The galaxy had learned that strength came not from perfection, but from the ability to adapt when perfection failed. They had discovered that wisdom was not just about knowing the right answers, but about finding answers when no right ones existed. Most importantly, they had understood that survival was not a temporary condition to be endured, but a skill to be mastered and shared. High Commander Zephyr materialized beside her, his crystalline form now bearing patterns that seemed to shift and change like human thoughts. "Admiral, the quarterly review shows continued improvement in defensive capabilities across all sectors. The integration protocols have exceeded all projections." Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on something else, a small personal message that had arrived through the quantum relay. It was from Earth, from a retirement community where the surviving veterans had quietly returned to the peaceful lives they had temporarily left behind. The message was from Captain Rodriguez, now fully recovered and apparently teaching tactical principles to his great-grandchildren using chess sets and toy soldiers. His note was brief and characteristic. The garden is growing well. The birds still come for breakfast. The young ones are learning fast. All secure on the home front. Sarah smiled, understanding the deeper meaning in his simple words. The veterans had done more than save the galaxy. They had shown it how to remain strong without losing its humanity. They had taught civilizations that had existed for millennia that there was always something new to learn, always another way to survive, always hope even in the darkest circumstances. The war was over, but the real victory was just beginning. The galaxy had learned to fight not just with weapons and technology, but with the accumulated wisdom of beings who had survived the unsurvivable. It had discovered that the greatest strength was not in never falling, but in always getting back up. And somewhere on a small world called Earth, old soldiers sat in gardens and smiled, knowing that the universe was a little safer because they had refused to let age, obsolescence, or impossible odds stop them from doing what needed to be done. The stars shone a little brighter, and for the first time in galactic history, every species in the Confederation could look up at those stars and know that no matter what came from the void between them, they would be ready. They had learned the most important lesson humanity had to offer, that as long as someone was willing to stand up and fight, surrender was never the only option.